Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. As I was just telling our next guest, it is a Shonda. It is a shame. It is a tragedy that I have not had him on earlier than this. It's one of these weird things where you all of a sudden you start realizing the people who kind of fell through the cracks. But I'm a big fan. I've known him a bit for a while. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, which AI would crush in softball if it was a little easier to get to games. And former head of policy planning at the State Department, all around former Harvard egghead guy, Peter Berkowitz. Welcome to the Remnant.
Good to be with you, Jonah. Thanks.
So I normally have a policy of asking people questions that I've always wanted an answer to, but like felt weird sending an email about, or like if I got stuck next to someone on a plane and they said, "Oh, well, yeah, I got my PhD in political theory and I know about Nietzsche and whatnot," I'd say, "Oh, well, let me ask you this. I've always wanted to ask this." So just to get out of the way, because if we start talking about Israel or politics, whatever, I don't know if we'll get back to it. I don't know if you know this about me, but I have a deep-seated, I think, fairly well thought through animosity towards American philosophical pragmatism. And although I really like reading Richard Rorty, okay, so there's a tension there. And I actually like William James for all sorts of reasons. I just don't like philosophical pragmatism. Anyway, I believe you used to, I think your first book was on Nietzsche, was
That is correct. Very, very few people in Washington know that, but it's true.
I remember I read it a long time ago.
I'm impressed.
My lips are still tired, and I can't swear I understood all of it. But that said, Rorty is sort of famous for this argument that I shouldn't say famous because almost no one knows this, but he's well known in certain circles for this argument that what William James and John Dewey were doing in terms of pragmatism in the United States was a somewhat kindred, although maybe emotionally very different, or culturally very different, but somewhat kindred philosophical project to what Heidegger and Nietzsche had been doing in Europe. Do you think that's right? Where do you think that's right? Where do you think that's wrong? Do you think that's obvious, or do you think that's obviously wrong? Just where do you think about it?
First, I want to say I would have never guessed this is a subject that we were going to speak about. It may be the second time in the 20 years I've been in Washington this has come up. And third, I'm delighted to take a crack at the question. Like you, or I should say I share with you, skepticism about philosophical pragmatism. I myself don't enjoy reading Richard Rorty. William James is a bit different. But I think that their philosophical enterprises, contrary to Rorty, are entirely different from Nietzsche's. Now, with Rorty, in one sense, there's a similarity. Nietzsche did understand himself, in one sense, overcoming the entirety of the Western philosophical tradition. Rorty, in an earlier book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, more or less suggested, well, Nietzsche was right, and therefore we have to, so to speak, begin again. We begin again with something we'll call pragmatism. We'll say philosophy amounts to, or the moral standard amounts to, whatever works in the circumstances. Of course, as you know, you've written about it, this is a transparent dodge, because what works in the situation itself is quite mysterious and open to many different interpretations and great contention. First. Second, Nietzsche actually had great reverence for Plato, Aristotle, and the philosophical tradition. Take his book Beyond Good and Evil. Rorty, focus on Rorty, not James, who I think is a more complex and interesting thinker, but Rorty, who is so popular, really wanted to get beyond good and evil, and his idea of moral philosophy was, or his idea of how to make a moral argument, more or less went like this. I've found X to be useful, pleasant, or rewarding. I recommend it to you as well. I can remember a lecture he gave at Harvard University at the Kennedy School of Government, in which he more or less made this argument about human rights. The best we can do is maybe travel around the world and say, worked well for us, we recommend you give it a try. Beyond that, he was not willing to enter into argument about philosophical matters. Nietzsche, on the other hand, devoted a great deal of his philosophical career to attempting to rescue the philosophical understanding of truth. Now, take, for example, his book, Beyond Good and Evil. Subtitle, often overlooked, is Toward a Philosophy of the Future. Also, his fascinating opening statement is not given the attention it deserves. You'll remember it. He begins, supposing truth is a woman, what then? Yes. So superficial readers take that to mean, Nietzsche disagrees with Plato. Truth is not something out there one can seek, one can search for. And I think it was Richard Rorty who invented the notion of truth with a capital T and truth with a small t. We can have truth with a small t. But of course, if one were to think about women, or even if one were to follow what Nietzsche goes on to say about women, his point is not that truth is not out there. His point is not that truth doesn't exist. His point is that truth is elusive, mysterious, requires patient and sometimes daring courting, that the philosophers have been poor lovers of truth. Now, who is it among the great philosophers of the past who connected philosophy to loving? Answer, among others, Plato. Who among the great philosophers listened patiently to a great lecture on the relationship between eros and truth? Answer, Plato in the Symposium. So Nietzsche is better understood as someone who believes that the great Western philosophical tradition from Plato down to the present has betrayed the pursuit of truth as understood from the beginning, and who seeks to stand up a new generation of philosophers who have the courage to pursue truth even to the most unlovely places. Whereas Richard Rorty was a sort of, everything's pretty good here in America. What do we have? Don't have to worry too much about things. And the best we can offer you is to do what works, and we can't really say much about what works.
Now, all credit, as you attested, I completely blindsided you with the question, and that was a pretty good answer for someone who's pretty blindsided by the question. You got points on the board. So another question I would ask if I was sitting next to you on the plane. You say you don't like reading Rorty. I'll just say that, like, Rorty at least writes as if he cares about having readers outside of a certain sort of, Gnostic sect that all understand the shibboleths and all that kind of stuff, right? But that's as far as I'm going to go in defending Rorty. That, and the fact that in a was it Achieving Our Country? Was that what it was?
Yes, short book, yes.
Where he, I thought, very smartly and astutely said the American left had wasted an enormous amount of time on Bolshevism and thinking about Bolshevism and thinking about Bolshevik Marxism. And I thought for a lefty to make that kind of point was useful.
I grant both those points. Rorty was a clear writer. In that mid-90s book, he exhibited frustration, impatience with what actually became what was becoming a postmodern left became a hyper-postmodern left, has become the woke left. So right. Absolutely give Rorty credit for that. But here's a story which may help illustrate my own impatience with Rorty, even though I acknowledge that you were right, good writer, and he began to see the bad directions which the left was going. This is a tale from probably late 80s, maybe mid-1980s, Princeton University. A PhD defense, Rorty's student, two other philosophy professors there, a political theorist is there. And the student is asked a question about John Rawls. John Rawls, as you know, was a seminal academic political theorist with books Theory of Justice and Political Liberalism. And the student went off in a rant against John Rawls. Finally, he was interrupted by one of the three examiners at this PhD dissertation defense. And the examiner said, I have one question concerning your critique of John Rawls. Have you ever actually read Rawls? To which the student replied with a kind of supercilious indignation, no. The implication being, well, he's read Foucault, Derrida, Lacan. Why would he waste his time on Rawls? So after the exam was concluded, Rorty turned to his two colleagues with embarrassment and said, I agree with everything that student said about what's wrong with Rawls, but the difference is I earned the right to say that. Meaning, Richard Rorty, has actually read Rawls and was familiar with the philosophical tradition. That's true, but Rorty left something out. Rorty encouraged the attitude displayed by that student, that the 2,000 years that had preceded the student were of no real interest because Foucault, Lacan, and Derrida had shown us that they were unnecessary for thinking seriously, for writing, for having an impact in the public sphere. So why waste your time on that sort of thing? This was a not so indirect message of Rorty's much of Rorty's philosophizing. So bully for him in the 1990s, but he'd already done a lot of damage.
That's all fair. I agree with that. So much is made. The sort of just airplane question is before I get to it. It's very difficult for me to judge how good a writer ancients writing in ancient Greek are, because it's always translations, and there's I don't know. You have to go. I don't know how much weight you put into the sort of Straussian argument about esoteric writing. So who are they signaling this to? Who are they really writing to? Is this a conversation behind a veil that I don't have access? All that kind of stuff. But of modern philosophers, I've generally had, particularly the postmodern crowd, I've generally had the view that they write poorly on purpose, that it is a kind of it's an exercise in sort of shibboleth manufacturing. It's like you have to be in on. It's a way to screen out people who aren't part of the team by just, if you think this is bad writing, like Homi Bhabha, right? If you think this is bad writing, that just shows you how unsophisticated you are, which is also sort of code for not part of the group. A friend of mine, he wrote, he did his PhD in history at Columbia, and at his defense for his dissertation, one of the people said, "Look, before we get started on anything else, I just want to say how just well written this is. It reads like journalism. It's really, the pages just move. It's great." And my friend's heart sank, because this, he knew, was code for a deep and abiding insult about how unserious the scholarship must be in that mind. And so, anyway, first of all, I'm kind of curious, what do you think of that? How much of that do you think is actually going on, or is that just my prejudice? And two, who would you say is the worst writer among major philosophers of, say, the 20th century? So it has to be in English. I can't speak to Heidegger, where, like we have to read 3 pages to find the verb or any of that kind of stuff. But
well, the last question first. The worst writer. And when you ask philosopher, you mean someone recognized already as
I'll give you
or almost
I'll give
canonical?
you my answer, which is John Dewey. I find that John Dewey's philosophical writing is to be exasperatingly verbose in ways that I find annoying, but that's also because of the era in which he was writing. But
it partly is. I could live with Dewey, because one can you say verbose. Yes, you can read 10 pages and have almost no idea.
Yeah.
how he has advanced the argument. That's true. Look, among the great philosophers, legendarily, Heidegger. But the case with Heidegger is different from people that professors, I do not regard as canonical figures. Homi Bhabha, Judith Miller often comes to mind. Certainly no philosopher, but a feminist, a critical theorist who is famous for producing unintelligible sentences. These items begin with a capital letter and eventually there's a period somewhere.
Right.
But the language is highly abstract. The words are not used by ordinary people. And the combination of them seems to most of us to lead nowhere. Is this intentional? I think it's intentional for the reasons you mentioned. Part of it has to do with the professionalization of philosophy that begins, especially in the German universities, toward the end of the 18th century. Was Kant maybe the first great canonical philosopher who was essentially a professor? Perhaps. And with Kant, we get really the crystallization of a professional language for talking about philosophy. When you're reading Plato, for that matter, Aristotle, Cicero, in medieval times, Aquinas is a bit different because he's such a great systematizer. But Maimonides, Farabi, and the Muslim and the Jewish traditions, these guys were not professional philosophers. And while their language may be, where their thinking may be difficult here and there, it's a vocabulary that's going to be largely familiar to literate people. That changes around the time of the 18th century. Where philosophy becomes a profession. And so, if you're going to practice law, you have to acquire the language of law. If you're going to practice medicine, there are technical terms you have to learn. From Kant forward, there were technical terms you had to learn. But what we see, especially in the last 40 years, 50 years, especially under the influence of French postmodernism, but now, of course, the United States is leading the league in debasing academic discourse. We saw, I think, as you were suggesting, Jonah, a deliberate effort to obfuscate, keep other people out, and suggest there are two teams here. You're with us or you're against us. And if you even raise questions about this language, it shows not only that you are intellectually feeble, but morally on the other side. This was not Kant's aim. It was not Hegel's aim. It was not Heidegger's aim to keep people out in that way. They understood themselves as achieving a new level of rigor, and they lived within a university. That's part of what happens. But I see something pernicious going on in this use of not just obfuscatory. I think the secret is sometimes it just is unintelligible. And if I may add, this phenomenon is quite different from what Strauss was talking about, the notion of esoteric writing, because the notion of esoteric writing actually depends upon writing using language that is clear. So Strauss's argument was that writers who did live in liberal democracies faced persecution for unorthodox thinking. So they were compelled to hide their deepest thoughts and convey a surface teaching that was at least consistent with political convention, what the authorities could live with. They couldn't convince the authorities that they were that their beliefs were consistent with convention unless those beliefs were intelligible. So even in translation, people who pick up Plato or Aristotle are initially amazed by the apparent simplicity and lucidity of the language. Now, following the arguments can be difficult, especially in Plato's case, because we're dealing with a literary format. In Plato, we have nothing but dialogues. And in that context, Strauss's thesis is even more compelling, because any of those any of us who've ever actually had a conversation know that we don't always say everything we know and believe. And we suspect that our interlocutors are every once in a while holding back or using irony, sometimes effectively, to convey multiple truths at the same time. So the older view and the thesis about esoteric writing is one that depends upon clarity. Whereas for our postmodern and woke friends, their continued sway depends on their obscurity.
All right, so I think everyone will agree that I have sufficiently checked the box on the eggheadery. And I can do this for the rest of the show, but like there are other things I do want to get to. And so I guess the bridge question would be: so I have been, and I've talked about this quite a bit with our mutual friend Yuval Levin, and I love intellectual history, right? I just do. And I think intellectual history is important. I think ideas have consequences. I think ideas are important. All that's stipulated. At the same time, I have come to a much more nuanced view about the importance of the history of ideas, insofar as I think, not in every instance, there's not a uniform rule. I'm against all monocausal explanations of the universe and all that, except maybe for like God. And but often the ideas are lagging indicators rather than leading indicators. That the ideas are to some extent pretextual, to justify more recognizable sort of Machiavellian elite power stuff, right? And so to bring it into the present day, the DEI or intersectionality or wokeness, before that political correctness, right? These are all, I'm not saying there aren't important ideas that led to this, but it feels to me more like there were certain people who knew what they wanted to do, and they go through the center aisle of the supermarket and they grab some Foucault and they grab some of this off here to gussy up what is more about essentially faction, power politics, circling the wagon, self-aggrandizement, feather bedding. And I'm not saying it can't be a catalytic process where the ideas fuel even more of this behavior, and more of this behavior legitimizes the ideas even more, right? It doesn't have to, it can be chicken and egg. But I just go back and you look at the 20th century. I spent a lot of time looking at people like Herbert Crowley, and everyone talks about how Herbert Crowley is the godfather of American progressivism and all of these sorts of things. And it is not entirely clear to me that Promise of American Life or The Greening of America, or a half dozen famous books that supposedly started movements were in fact totems that symbolized a movement that it was already there, and they needed some swag to sort of symbolize what they were already doing. And I'm just wondering, since you're someone who's sort of dedicated much of their life to about the primacy or the importance of ideas, like, where do you come down on all of
that? Especially in this matter, I tend to be, to borrow your excellent phrase, a chicken and egg guy. I mean, it seems to me obvious that in the debate between are ideas the leading causal factor of what takes place in political society or events? It's the interaction of ideas and events. But let's take the specific case that you've put before before us: postmodernism, identity politics, wokeism, diversity, equity, inclusion. So on the one hand, we certainly see a powerful trend within American constitutional government, liberal democracy, to increasingly demand freedom from external constraints, to increasingly break down the claims of tradition, to increasingly say each individual chooses for himself or herself not only what religion to worship, not only whom he or she will marry, but whether he or she is a he or she. We break down all barriers. Okay, so that is encouraged by, it seems to me, a free and democratic society. The United States is the oldest such, and it shouldn't be a surprise that these tendencies have worked themselves out in a way that we continually extend our founding principles, to the detriment, by the way, I should say, of those founding principles. That said, we also have choices. We can constrain those principles. We can bring to light other considerations. I see much of what undergirds DEI, postmodernism, wokeism, as you also suggested, a desire for power. Certain groups have discovered that certain sets of arguments actually have amazing purchase on people in power, especially on elites. But let's go back and review the history. We've had documented, at least since 1951, by the great William F. Buckley in his first book, God and Man at Yale, arguably the only boring book he ever wrote, because even the great William F. Buckley could not make the summary of course syllabi fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
He did probably as best as anybody could, but already then he provided chapter after chapter of evidence, as you know, probably most of your listeners know, but worth emphasizing, that by the late 1940s, the Yale University social science faculty was bent on teaching its students collectivism, progressivism, using the state to bring about happiness for the people,
Mm-hmm.
and that the humanities faculties were bent on teaching atheism, not teaching that among the possibilities out there was atheism, but the atheism is the true and complete understanding of the world. So our universities have been promulgating since at least the late 1940s ideas out of step with traditional American understandings, I would say even founding ideas. So while on the one hand, I think many of today's proponents of DEI, many teachers of postmodernism or identity politics have as a no longer very well disguised motive, a determination to undercut the claims of authority that this group has made or that group has made, debunk the Constitution, which in their view gives more power to their groups, their outgroups, they're historically discriminated against groups. Okay, a bid for power. At the same time, they weren't just walking down the grocery store aisle and said, this is going to help me get the stain out. No, they have been for 75 years been educated in an educational system that more intensely teaches them all claims for the past are not just suspect. Fine, we learn independent thought, but they're no longer. It's not so much that they're suspect; it's that they're convicted of the familiar racism, classism, sexism, ethnocentrism, and so on. I believe that we have here a case in which, and now from K through 12, our youngest professors have been marinated in the idea that the United States is divided between oppressors and oppressed. And they see, maybe they can't always admit it to themselves, they discern, they intuit how useful these arguments can be to them in acquiring not just a sinecure professionally, but more power for their groups outside their professional discipline.
Yeah, no, I'm a both and guy on a lot of these things, but if you broaden it out beyond the universities, because I think that and this is a family podcast, but I think it's fair to say that that one of the biggest problems with the elite university system is that they believe their own bullshit, right? And so it's a complicated problem because, and I'm sure you've encountered it as much as I have. You try to explain to them that you are actually for. I mean, to sort of borrow a Rortyian trick, right? I am for lowercase d, lowercase d diversity. I'm for lowercase e equity to a certain extent, and I'm certainly for a lowercase I inclusion. But these capital letter things require you to not only express sympathy with the high concept, but with the actual tangible allocation of resources and exclusion of certain groups in a programmatic way, or you are bad. I mean, I generally find the sort of tendency on the right to say everything is Marxist that they don't like kind of exhausting at this point.
Yes.
But there is a rhetorical echo in the arguments of Ibram Kendi and Marxism, in the sense that,
of course,
the Marxists were great at saying it is no accident that, or this is objectively fascist, right? Because they wanted to invoke the authority of science,
yes,
and sort of universal omniscience while dethroning God. And so Kendi's whole argument about how whether something is racist or not basically boils down to you have to agree and support the policies I like, or you are a racist regardless of what's in your heart. And that's a very Marxist kind of move. And it's difficult for me to credit a lot of the people who sign up for that stuff as it not being more a product of motivated reasoning than actual persuasion, because I find the arguments very, very weak.
Yes, because weak, that's already generous. Often they're not arguments. Come back to that. But first, please, even this not to Rorty is too much. We don't need to speak about diversity with a capital D and small d. We need to say this. Of course we're for diversity, equity, inclusion. But what the DEI crowd means by diversity is sameness. What they mean by equity, it's absolutely clear. Discriminating against people on the basis of race. And what they mean by inclusion is exclusion. So we're for it, but we're opposed to what they seek under the label diversity, equity, inclusion, which is sameness, discrimination, and exclusion. I quite agree with you about the style of Kendi's argument. And just this week, I'm reading and going to write about a book which displays this at a much higher level of sophistication. It's a book by Sam Moyne, a professor of history and law at Yale University. It's a angry critique of Cold War liberalism, who he thinks betrayed the Enlightenment and betrayed liberalism because they limited the political project to the American political project to protecting individual rights, and because they were worried about the danger of entrusting government with the job of promoting the good life for all Americans. What he means by the good life is a life in which we make ourselves the authors of our existence. Richard Rorty.
Also some Rawls in there, but
also a tiny bit more. You would see more Rorty than Rawls. Never mind. Point is, he makes some very bold claims about what's at the heart of the Enlightenment, what's at the heart of liberalism, and the wickedness of the Cold War liberalism outlook. Maybe I shouldn't say wickedness, but the debased character of their thinking.
We should explain for listeners who he means by Cold War liberals. So can you just give me some name check?
Yes, I should. Although here too he operates in a somewhat perverse manner. His collection of Cold War liberals includes Judith Shklar, Isaiah Berlin, Karl Popper, Hannah Arendt, Lionel Trilling.
That's a mixed bag.
It's not that none those people don't belong, although Hannah Arendt is questionable there. It's that when we think of Cold War liberals, that is men and women who rose to the defense of the free world, of liberal democracy against the threat of communism, you're much more likely to think in the first breath of Hayek and Raymond Aron. I think of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Jean J. Kirkpatrick. Never mind for his eccentric grouping. The point is the structure of his book. He doesn't actually argue for his interpretation of the Enlightenment, and he doesn't actually mount a critique of the political harms of the Cold War liberal view. For him, the refutation of Cold War liberalism is to demonstrate that Cold War liberalism differs from his own preferred moral and political opinions. Mm-hmm. There's no argument in favor of the idea that that democracy in America ought to be devoted to emancipating all of our citizens from tradition, whether they like it or not. That's the true view. And there's no real argument again about the political costs or the unwisdom of the general sensibility of the Cold War liberals. Not even discuss that they were wrong that Soviet communism represented a genuine threat to all they held dear. Merely the refutation is the identification of the difference, just as with Ibram X. Kendi. There's no such thing as neutrality here. There's no such thing as not being part of this debate. Either you agree with me on every matter of my anti-racist agenda, or you're a racist. There are only those two choices. Comrade, you're either with us or against us.
Yeah, I mean, I've been arguing for years that the single most fascistic statement used daily in American life is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? Because basically you're basically saying you are someone who needs to be fixed or bowled over, or you're with us. And that kind of thinking is all over the left, right? I mean, I just think that, and like, this is if when I do a sort of a understand progressivism 101 talks about the 20th century, the basic shorthand is the arguments change to whichever path is the shortest route to expediency and power, right? So, you start with Wilson, who's very much a congressional guy. Congress needs to be supreme, but then he gets to be president. So he's like, okay, president needs to be supreme. Liberals then go with an imperial presidency for a while, get through FDR, and then they realize, oh, no, it's got to be the courts, and then it's, or it's got to be the bureaucracy. It's always just going where the field is open towards ends. And I got to say now, since we're almost 40 minutes in here, this sort of gets to the next phase, is that I think I've paid my dues as a loyal foot soldier in the forces of the right for a very long time, but I've become an inveterate and unapologetic both sideser. And I see a lot of these problems manifesting themselves on the right. And I do not dispute for a moment, because this is the most common rebuttal I get is, okay, maybe you're right, maybe you're not, but the left controls everything. And, so Hollywood, higher education, journalism. I have no dispute with the claim that the distribution of power and influence is asymmetric in our country. And one of the reasons you get the bad things happening on the right is because of that asymmetry. This idea that all the elite institutions look down on flyover people, for a better term, or traditional minded people or whatever, is one of the reasons you've gotten the reaction that you've gotten. Still, that doesn't mean I like the reaction. And we're seeing rise of sort of, depending on what you call them, nationalists or post-liberals. They've sort of split off into the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea these days. But there's a lot of that going on. Adrian Vermeule, Patrick Deneen, and whatnot. And getting back to my point about how sometimes the ideas are lagging indicators, I would argue that a lot of the stuff that is much broader than the intellectual side of things, because say what you will about Adrian Vermeule and Patrick Deneen, they're intellectuals and they're and they deserve a certain amount of seriousness with which you take them. If you go out into the broader political infrastructure of a lot of right-wing media, the arguments in favor of this or that approach are lagging indicators from the need to justify a rationale for Donald Trump and his candidacy. And we can go all the way back to the Flight 93 election stuff with that. And so the reason why I get more worked up about what's going on the right these days is because I'm used to it from the left. And I think that the American political system desperately needs a healthy and serious political conservatism that is rightly informed by American traditions and American liberalism, or we're toast. Because you can't have two statist parties. You can't have two sort of you can't have two gas pedals and no brake pedal in a healthy political system. And so I'm just wondering, big picture, where do you? I just didn't want to blindside you by let you say stuff and then me come at you by disagreeing or agreeing or whatever. So I just wanted to lay down level set. Where do you? How do you think about all of this stuff going on the intellectual side, but also on the political side?
I have a very long answer to this question, but this podcast will not last for 2 or 3 years. So I'm going to make it brief. I wrote a short book, very short book, an extended essay about 10 years ago called Constitutional Government, Liberty, Self-Government, and Political Moderation. And I made the case there that there were varieties of conservatism in the United States. And we don't, of course, everybody is vying for the title true conservative. This is not a fruitful contest because in contrast to liberalism, which has actually a substantive concept at the center, freedom, which we can quarrel about, conservatism is always relative to particular tradition.
Right.
So you always have to ask yourself, what are you making a priority of conserving? And I argued in that book, and have continued to argue since then, that reasonable and wise Americans ought to make a priority of conserving America's founding principles, the charter of government that instituted them, the Constitution, and the moral and political preconditions for maintaining a free society. That doesn't obviously end all quarrels, but it's a good place to begin the debate. I have written at some length in criticism, sometimes in sharp criticism, of our national conservative friends and our common good conservative friends. What unites them is a hatred for something they call liberalism. For a while, a longer time ago, I thought it might be useful to revive this term, save it from its association with the left wing of the Democratic Party, save it from its association with the idea of being a tax and spend political kind of guy. There's a problem out there. Let's raise taxes, spend more money on it. It'll get better. But in recent years, I've found it's more useful, probably more accurate, to speak about the modern tradition of freedom. There is such a tradition. The American constitutional government is one of the gems of this tradition. And there's a defining thought or conviction. You might even say self-evident truth that defines this tradition. Actually tells you whether you're in it or not in it. And that conviction is that human beings are by nature free and equal, principle on which our nation's founded. If you embrace that idea, you're part of our tradition. Terrific. And by the way, I have friends outside of our tradition, but you're in a different tradition. I believe it. I believe that the NatCons and the common good conservatives who believe that their number one enemy is the modern tradition of freedom, for them, exemplified by John Locke, especially one book by John Locke, the second treatise, especially one chapter in that book, the second chapter on the state of nature, especially one paragraph in that. That is the source, they believe, of all of our problems. Just a parentheses, I will mention that you would never know from Patrick Deneen, Yoram Khazoni, Adrian Vermeule, that John Locke wrote an entire book about how to cultivate virtues in children from the moment of birth until reaching the age of maturity. In any case, I think I stand with you in being deeply worried about anti-liberal tendencies on the left, which are not merely tendencies, they are proclaimed opposition in Deneen, in Vermeule, in Chazoni. The idea that the ideas associated with Locke, they don't like to say also the Declaration of Independence, but Deneen has more or less said that. These are evil opinions about what human beings are and what can become, and they must be overcome. This is deeply worrying. I'm not sure how closely they're related, but also all tendencies in politics, on the right, on the left as well as the right, on the right as well as the left, that proclaim we have reached a point of American politics in which half of our polity, or a third of our polity on the other side, should not even be considered as Americans. Their views are so un-American as to disqualify them from respect as citizens. This is the language that justifies civil war, and it is a long-standing, venerable teaching of the modern tradition of freedom that almost nothing justifies civil war. So I'm opposed to all those today who are making arguments that that push us in the direction of civil war.
All right, so not to beat a dead horse on this, but so one of the reasons why I've had this sort of quasi-epiphany about ideas often being lagging rather than leading indicators is if you actually go back and you look, in part because of my engagement with Deneen and these guys, also working on my last book, that a lot of the ideas that we call liberalism don't begin as ideas. They begin as quirky cultural norms, right? The British, or I should say the English, were just weird, right? And there's a lot of the stuff that we get, literally some of it comes from the fact of like banning cousin marriage. And then there's stuff about, the sanctity of one's hut and these various customs that over time get improved upon, systematized, turned into doctrine, right? So like the man's home is his castle eventually becomes the Fourth Amendment, but it starts as like this quirky, weird 7th or 9th century English custom kind of thing. And the only reason I bring this up is that what drives me crazy about the Hazoni Deneen approach to Locke is they seem to think that if they could just get a big enough bottle of whiteout and get rid of that paragraph that you're talking about, the entire spell would dispel and no one would believe in liberalism anymore. When I trust that when you were teaching, at Harvard, like the share of your students who had read before you assigned it, the second treatise on government, was pretty small, right? The average American doesn't read this stuff. The average American can't tell you what's in Montesquieu or Locke or any of these things, but the average American knows they have a right to a fair trial. The American knows they have the right to free speech because these are cultural norms that they can appeal to the authority of these ideas if they need to, or their lawyers can. But the reality is that this is a liberal country, regardless of what the paper says. Now, I'm all in favor of the paper, particularly the Constitution, and I think it's an important thing. But the reason it has power is because we give it power, we give it reverence. And the idea, though, that you can argue the American people out of, like Sohrab Ahmari, I used to love reading him talk about how they were going to impose the highest good, this Aristotelian highest good, by yoking themselves to Trumpian populism. And I always loved the image, I don't know where I first got it from, of him going into a biker bar in South Dakota and explaining to bikers for Trump that we're going to ban porn because the Pope says so. It's just like that. It doesn't work as an actual political program, in part because they just want to argue with the ideas. I get wanting to argue with ideas, but you have to actually argue with the habits of the heart. And this is a liberal country. It's always been a liberal country, and gotten more or less liberal over time, depending on all sorts of things, but it's not driven primarily by the ideas. It's driven by the deep, abiding cultural commitments that are a reservoir in this country.
Agree. I have a high philosophical point to make about it, but I'm going to begin with an anecdote about my niece when she was 4 years old. When she was 4 years old, her parents announced to her and her sisters that that tomorrow workers were coming to install carpeting in the family room. Once the new carpeting was installed, the children would no longer be allowed to eat in the family room. Carpeting was duly installed. The next morning, my sister, my niece's mother, found my niece, my 4-year-old niece, happily eating her cereal, watching TV in the family room on the brand new carpeting. My sister, somewhat indignant, said, "Tali, I thought I told you very clearly that you're not allowed to eat on the new carpeting." Tali, without looking up from the TV, replied to her mother, "Yes, Mommy, but you are not the rules of me." Now, 4-year-old Tali, I'm quite confident, rules of me, autonomy, had not read Kant and not
Right.
read Locke. Somehow, at the age of 4 years old, she had imbibed a principle of our regime. Well, properly understood, the principle would be once you achieve maturity, Tali, and the fullness of the development of your rational faculties, you'll take responsibility for yourself. How did she learn that? Well, the children's books she reads, the cartoons, the TV shows she was watching, the general sensibilities she had already absorbed. Now, 2 higher philosophical points from Aristotle. From Aristotle, we learn, I'm just now saying that, Jonah, your views are backed by great authority, Aristotle. Aristotle teaches us that if we want to understand the behavior of citizens, we need to understand the kind of regime in which they live, because the arrangement of political offices gives them lessons about what their expectations should be. If you live in a liberal democracy whose laws are based on the idea that human beings or citizens are free and all human beings are free and equal, but citizens share equally in rights, this is going to teach citizens willy-nilly that they control large swaths, or they should control large swaths of their life. Second, there is a huge misunderstanding of Aristotle in Danin, in Socrates, in Adrian Vermeule. Aristotle did not teach that our aim in politics should be to instantiate the best regime which promotes the best life. Aristotle is quite clear on this. He says, we have a standard of what's good in politics, but generally and for the most part, you're going to be lucky if you find yourself in a decent, tolerable regime. It's a kind of mix where the wealthy people, who tend to be few, and the majority of people, who tend to have less money, they're going to have to split power. We call this mix of oligarchy and democracy, Aristotle called it polity. And for the most part in politics, the best you can hope for is to prevent things from getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the oligarchs are always going to have a tendency to want more power for those who have achieved wealth, status, and power. And the people are always going to want a piece of the wealth, power, and status that the oligarchs have. So you're in permanent tension. You want to stabilize things. Aristotle's message was not take whatever form of political life you have and attempt to institute the best form of politics and have the regime teach virtue. So Aristotle's political lesson is one of moderation in these regards. And I believe that when it comes to constitutional government in the United States, Aristotle's message is understand your regime, understand the spirit of the people, understand its blessings, understand its weaknesses, appreciate that, like all regimes, it will tend to take its principles to the extreme, and develop public policies, develop rhetoric, make arguments in the realms of ideas that help temper its worst excesses and that help sustain its greatest blessings.
I like that answer. I think there's there are two kinds of people. They're the kind of people who divide the world up into two kinds of people, and then there are the other kinds of people. And your colleague, a great hero for everybody, Tom
Yeah.
Sowell.
Yes. Yes.
Constrained versus unconstrained. Yuval has been writing a lot about insiders versus outsiders. We've all do left versus right, and these all have different benefits and drawbacks depending on the context. I think that one of the things I wish I could teach more people is to appreciate various good things because they're hedges against bad things rather than guarantees for good things, right? So, like, our constitutional system is not set up to make perfect society. It's set up to be a hedge against horrible society, right? Jews educate their kids to fare thee well and want them to be doctors and lawyers, not so they'll be rich, but so that they will never be poor, right? And that's the hedge against bad things that's why I do not fetishize democracy. I perfectly open to the idea that democracy yields all sorts of terrible results sometimes, and the voters can be wrong, but democracy is a great hedge against worse things.
Yes.
And so anyway, I if you feel free to respond to that, but I also just wanted, in the time we got left, so it wasn't until basically before October 7th, obviously, that I started to focus on the constitutional crisis in Israel, which is now kind of a dead letter for a little while. But I'd never really, if someone had asked me to describe Israel's political system, I think I could get kind of close, fairly well. I had not really appreciated until I started looking into the constitutional crisis, the Supreme Court stuff, how truly fakakta Israel is a political system, right? And I think it's that was one of those fights where I agreed. I'm talking about being a both sideser. I thought the people who said, look, this is no way to run a Supreme Court, this is crazy, had really good points on their side. And the people who were out in the streets protesting this effort, I think, had really legitimate concerns. And so I'm kind of curious, how you view, just put October 7th aside because it's so, it's really a pre and post thing. But it seems to me that Israel is a really good illustration of the point I was making earlier, that that Israel has a really incredibly rich civil society, social capital, intellectual capital, moral capital, spiritual capital that can compensate for the fact that its civic infrastructures are ridiculous. And we've got really great civic infrastructures, but we got real problems with our social, moral, and political capital in this country. And it's a weird inversion. And it shows out that you can you can do without the training wheels of a constitution if you've got, as John Adams would put it, like a morally centered people who know what they're about. But if you don't have that stuff, you could be in real trouble. I mean, that's just the way I've been thinking about it lately. Do you think I'm wrong about Israel's system to begin with?
A couple quick reactions. Actually, you'll forgive me for agreeing with you again, but I think your basic assessment is correct about the judicial controversy. Ever since Aaron Barak's led constitutional revolution of the mid-1990s, which dramatically aggrandized the Supreme Court's power, essentially giving it authority to rule on almost any matter that arises and to assess the reasonableness of that matter. It became clear pretty quickly that it was necessary to rein the court in. That said, the proposals put forward by the Netanyahu government were extreme. Just to give you one example from the original set of proposals, from which the proposals never recovered. Proposals included something called Piskat HaHitgabrut, the override clause, which would have given a bare majority in the Knesset of 61, 120-seat Knesset, the ability to override a decision of the Supreme Court. Effectively, that would have swung the pendulum from one extreme, the Supreme Court has the authority to intervene in any matter, to the other extreme, saying the Supreme Court has the final say in no matter, since any matter can be overruled by a simple majority. not time to go through all the other mistakes that were made in the judicial reform. But let's put it this way. Significant reform was necessary, but the reforms that were proposed were wildly in excess and were responsible for, in my judgment, for provoking the months of protests that would be continuing. Israel would be in the midst of a constitutional crisis now, if it were not in the midst of a existential crisis caused by a hard existential crisis, security crisis caused by the October 7th massacres and Israel's need to exercise its right of self-defense. There was an earlier point, though, that you made, a segue that I also wanted to respond to. But
about how Israel's its political system is fakakta.
Yes. So yes, a quick story. Well, yes, that, but also the resilience of Israeli civil society. So, like the United States, Israel declared independence amid war. United States in 1776, Israel in 1948. Like the United States, in its Declaration of Independence, Israel announced that the nation would be founded based on a number of basic rights and fundamental freedoms. Complicating, it also announced that Israel would be a state for all of its people, that Arabs would be offered citizenship on equal terms. So Israel was founded as a rights-protecting democracy. It's complicated because Israel was also founded as the nation state of the Jewish people. That creates tensions, but we know in politics that a principle or an institution create tensions is not a reason to get rid of it, because all political principles and institutions and policies create tensions. So Israel was founded as a state that was Jewish, free, and democratic, that protected rights and was democratic. The Declaration of Independence itself proclaims that within 2 years, a constitutional assembly needs to be created to create a governing structure. But war and then the continuing threat of war never gave Israel the opportunity to do what the United States did, which was, the United States actually, we had Articles of Confederation, but even 15 years later, Israel was not able, because of crisis after crisis, to actually convene the constituent assembly that the declaration called for. Israel also faced another challenge to forgive the emergence of a fakakta political system. Remember, in the years following the War of Independence, Israel absorbed a refugee population equal to or slightly larger than the whole state at the time. More than 600,000 Jews, 600,000 to 800,000 Jews were expelled or forced to flee from their homes in North Africa and the Middle East. In any case, the net result was Israel does not have a proper constitution. It is a set of piecemeal enacted basic laws. They are inadequate to the task. It was eventually headed for a constitutional crisis. One quick story, if I may. I was talking to a friend yesterday who teaches at Harvard, and whose son also now goes to Harvard. He was telling me that in his son's friend group was an Israeli who came to Harvard after his military service. And he said, this friend seems to be, a kind of college, the Israeli, he's 24, 25, a college Marxist. He's in favor of drastic reform, even revolution, it's possible. A day after the October 7th massacres, he's a sophomore at Harvard. He got on a plane to return to Israel to join his troop, his brigade, and fight in Gaza. Subsequently, my friend had dinner with his son and a couple classmates at Harvard. They're Americans, and all of them expressed astonishment at what their friend did. Drop everything. He was a sophomore at Harvard to go fight, risk his life for his country. And all of them express doubts that they would do such a thing. Yeah, so Israeli civil society has a vibrancy and a resiliency that that has seen it through to a considerable extent. The shock, the trauma, the heartbreak of the massacres, and the continuing heartbreak of waking up every day and seeing on the front page of the newspaper above the fold the beautiful young faces of 2 or 3 more soldiers who have perished. All that said, there's reason for us to continue to be worried about our friends in Israel and our friend Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, because yes, the debate over judicial reform has been judicial reform or regime change, as the critics call it, has been sidelined. But all the old enmities, the pre-October 7th enmities and grievances remain, and they are now accompanied and intensified by a new grievance. Each side blames the other side for a lack of readiness, preparedness, which led to October 7th. The right blames the left, led by many leaders and former leaders of the military, for weakening the country. The opposition blames the Netanyahu government and the extreme elements for provoking necessary demonstrations and for provoking Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza. So while we see heroism and great resilience of civil society in Israel, Israel faces some very tough times ahead, it seems to me.
Yeah, so just a couple of points. I mean, you know this stuff better than I do, so I'm totally open to correction. But it was my understanding, I can't remember where I got this, but it was someone who knew what they were talking about, that part of the problem was that Ben-Gurion, like all the founders of Israel, they were fairly typical European socialists to one extent or another, Jabotinsky notwithstanding. And they saw like the idea of an upper chamber of parliament, you know, a Lords or a Senate, as a hindrance. They saw constitutions themselves as a hindrance on that sort of generic, you know, inevitability of progress towards socialism, right? And so, I mean, that's the only thing that at least was my understanding of it. So I agree, obviously, the fact that they're constantly being attacked has to play a role in all of that. But there was also sort of an ideological opposition to the whole very idea. And so I'm just kind of curious, do you think, because, you know, the old joke is you get 5 Jews in a room and you get 7 opinions and, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And there are all the jokes about the guy on the island who has 2 synagogues and he won't go to the other one, right? You know, so like, I get it.
Yeah.
So the idea of having a constitutional convention is almost a Saturday Night Live skit to me, or a Mel Brooks movie, you know, for Israelis, because Israelis are more contentious than American Jews too. And at the same time, it just feels like no way to run a railroad. And I'm not a big fan of parliamentary democracy, but at least have an upper house, right? Or at least have rules about how the Supreme Court is going to work. I didn't know until this stuff that if you like, you know, in American jurisprudence, you need to have standing to bring a lawsuit. You don't need to have standing to take something to the Supreme Court in Israel. That's nuts.
Yes, or put it slightly differently. Everybody has standing.
Right.
You don't like X, doesn't matter. You weren't directly affected by it. Your cousins weren't directly affected by it. Nobody knows affected by it. You think it's wrong, you can bring it to the Supreme Court. By the way, it's not just standing, it's justiciability. It's easier to say in Hebrew. Barak, I think, in a dictum, wrote a very simple Hebrew sentence, Hakol shafit. Everything is justiciable. Was it a good idea to declare war yesterday? Well, that's why shouldn't the Supreme Court decide on that? The structure of the security barrier. Why shouldn't the Supreme? Everything is in principle justiciable, whether it's been legislated on or not. Why? Because the very idea of the Supreme Court authorizes us to be the final statement on what's consistent with the principles of reason and democracy. Okay, yes, that's Forkinianism, That's left-wing living constitutionalism
Mm-hmm.
on steroids. You're right. Moreover, I think your other point is sound. It's not just that Ben Gurion was not schooled in uh, Anglo-American principles of limited government. He was a socialist. Um, it was not just that he thought he was the wise man for the moment and did not wish to be constrained. It was also the third point. It was both those points, but it was also Israel was in genuine emergency conditions. In fact, the emergency conditions, which were both security and economic, Israel's a kind of economic powerhouse now. But for 20 years, it lived in a period it called Tsena, the period of austerity, government-imposed restrictions. So all of these considerations led to a sidelining. Plus, I guess the fourth you mentioned. Yes, the Jews are a contentious people. Yes, and they're even more contentious now. The great Ruth Gavizon, a professor of constitutional law at Hebrew University, a woman on the left who, in her 50s and 60s, migrated to the Sensible Center, was a student of American constitutional government. She actually sought agreements among the various parties in Israel, but she recognized that a constitutional convention was not in the cards because you need supermajorities to agree to constitutional basics. So Gavizon's idea was, at best, to seek legislation for some basic organizing principles of the legislature and the judiciary. The Israelis are a long way off from a bicameral legislature, and unfortunately, they live in this paradox, and they have for a long time, that the very conditions that make the establishment and ratification of a constitution so urgent also make it so elusive.
Right.
That is the tremendous divisions within the population. Just off the top of my head, I can identify the secular progressive elites who dominate in Tel Aviv, especially in the high-tech industry, the religious nationalists who are different from the ultra-Orthodox who opt out of military service, the Mizrahi Jews. These are Jews who hail from North Africa and the Arab world, who tend to be more traditional. This is to say nothing of 20% of the population, 21%, that is the Arab citizens of Israel, who, while formally enjoying full rights, still are a community that has not been nearly fully integrated into Israeli life. Under these circumstances, it's difficult to imagine the formation of supermajorities around constitutional principles. Unfortunately, what's difficult to imagine is also urgently necessary.
All right. Do you have to go?
I can hang out for a bit.
Okay. Well, one last bit, and then I promise I'll let you go.
Okay.
So I read your exchange about the Robert Kagan.
Yes.
Trump's a dictator kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then the attacks on you from the Bulwark and yada yada yada. We don't have to get too deep in the weeds on all this. We can put links to the various things.
Yeah.
So I think all of your criticisms of Kagan are well taken. I think that the catastrophism is one of the reasons we're in the mess that we're in, and this is one of my bullet points on my passionate both sideserism, right? And the right catastrophizes, the left catastrophizes. A lot of really ridiculous people who are part of like the sort of griftery social media far right, literally, I mean, like what is it, Chernovich? There are these people who are literally saying that if Biden gets reelected, there is going to be a Hutu versus Tutsi genocide where conservatives are going to be killed in their homes. Millions and millions of people are going to be killed if the Biden regime is reelected. I think we don't have to debate this. I think that's very, very stupid, right? And very, very dangerous just to tell marginal people that this is part of the conversation. So, and at the same time, my standard response to is Trump Hitler for his first term was, look, Trump's not Hitler. Hitler could have repealed Obamacare, right? And so I do think I probably more than you, reading a little bit between the lines of your piece, I'm more concerned about a second Trump presidency, in part because of all the people who will not be around him in a second Trump presidency. And I think that as a rule of good, decent American rhetoric and politics and custom, when you say you're running for retribution, when you're saying you're running for revenge, when you say you want to repeal suspend the Constitution to get back in power, those should just be disqualifying things. And then to get elected after saying those things is bad for the country. Where I think I disagree with you a little bit is that while I don't think he'd try to be Hitler, I don't think he'd invade Poland or any of that kind of stuff, right? I do think that he would, let's put it this way, you don't have to be 100% sure someone's going to be a dictator to be worried about it, right? If you think there's a 10% chance, that's bad. If you think there's a 100% chance that he'd be a 10% dictator, that's bad too. And I do think that you look at the kind of people he wants to put into the Department of Justice, some of the people that the sort of heritage adjacent people, all of that, the things they are saying about how the Federalist Society doesn't know what time it is and we need people who are really willing to test the limits of things, that's dangerous unto itself. And isn't that softer claim worthy of abiding concern?
Yes. As I pointed out in the piece, of course, actually, presidents who are 10% dictator is actually a common feature of American politics. Our system was set up because we presume that people who reach the apex of power will have those tendencies in excess compared to the rest of us. Both of my pieces were, as they say in the law, narrowly tailored to meet just one criticism, one claim, is that Trump is destined to be a dictator. And and I have one fear of that. If you say that Trump is destined to be a dictator, you are authorizing all means necessary. All means necessary. In 1942 in Berlin, there's a plot to assassinate Hitler. A reasonable person doesn't ask himself or herself if that's consistent with the law. A reasonable person assassinates Hitler. Mm-hmm. So that's what I worry about on the left and the right. I didn't try to address the range of other concerns that arise when in contemplating a second Trump presidency. Am I worried? Yes, I'm worried. Are there a multitude of criticisms to make of Donald Trump? Every time Donald Trump speaks, it seems he says something outrageous that could cause worry. On the other hand, George Will made a comment like the one you just made. He said, Trump is dictator. In his first presidency, he couldn't build more than a few miles of the fence that he intended to, the 30-foot fence across the whole border with Mexico that he intended to build. How is this man going to institute democracy? Now, the moment the argument shifts to this kind of harm or that kind of harm that could be caused to government, to the people in the United States, to government in the United States, from my point of view, we're on a different plane. And I'm also, as you know, I'm simultaneously worried about the weaponization of the Justice Department and the FBI to get Trump. And when I think about pushing the United States in the direction of authoritarianism, into significant parts of bureaucracies, abandoning the idea that they are disinterested technocrats and embracing the notion that they're out there to serve the agenda of a political party, that worries me. And the example now, the second time of a sitting president authorizing his Justice Department to go against the leading candidate, those of the other party, that also has the form of dictatorship. Now, I believe neither side should be using this language. Well, I'll leave it at there. Neither side should be using that language. Most of the criticisms of Trump and most of the criticisms of Biden can be made without using a kind of language that authorizes followers to engage in lawless action. And again, it seems to me, if you're bent on saying the other guy, the other candidate, means to institute dictatorship, you are encouraging lawlessness.
I think that's all perfectly fair and defensible. I agree with that. All right. Peter Berkowitz, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll come back.
I would love to. Thank you for your questions and observations.